Welcome to this deep dive. You sent us something really thought-provoking. A 1992 scholarly article titled Helping Learners Construct Knowledge by Hegland and Andre.
That's right. And uh, what we want to unpack for you today is their take on how we as learners actually build our understanding of things. They don't just present their own ideas, though. They're specifically looking at a perspective put forward by another academic, Cunningham, in the very same year. He argued that educational psychology was missing something important.
Right, he felt it was too attached to older ways of thinking, not really capturing the active role of the person learning.
Exactly, yeah. Cunningham proposed that semiotics, which at its core is the study of signs and symbols and how we create meaning through them, offered a completely different and, in his view, a much better way to understand how we learn and know. Now, Hagelin and Andre, they agree with him on some fundamental aspects, but they also have some significant counter-arguments. They also look at how these ideas fit into the history of learning theories and compare Cunningham's ideas to what was considered, current thinking back in the early 90s.
So, the heart of our discussion is this idea of you, as the learner, actively building your knowledge. It might sound obvious, but as we'll explore, this concept has a long and fascinating history, and it's still incredibly relevant to how we think about education today. I'm expecting some real aha moments for you as we go through this. Okay, so let's get started. What exactly was Cunningham's main argument?
Well, according to Hagelin and Andre, Cunningham began his 1992 article by stating that educational psychology was too neo-behaviorist, positivistic, and objectivistic.
Hmm.
Think of it as him saying the field was too focused on just observing behavior and assuming there's one objective truth that's simply passed on to a student who doesn't really actively participate in building that understanding.
So he saw the dominant view as a bit like a one-way street where knowledge just flows from the teacher to a passive student.
Precisely. And his alternative was semiotics. He believed this approach, looking at how we interpret signs and symbols, could unlock deeper insights into the complexities of how we learn and form knowledge insights that traditional educational psychology was, well, missing.
Okay, so where did Hegland and Andre actually find common ground with Cunningham? It wasn't a complete disagreement, was it?
No, not at all. They clearly listed several key areas where they agreed. First and foremost, they concurred with Cunningham's central point. Knowledge isn't something you passively receive. You actively build it yourself through your interactions with the world around you.
That makes intuitive sense. It's not like our brains are just empty hard drives waiting to be loaded with information, right?
Exactly. Secondly, they both agreed that knowledge resides in our minds. External things, like the words we're using right now or the text in the article you sent, these are just representations, attempts by one person to guide another toward a similar understanding.
So your interpretation of Hegland and Andre's article and my attempt to understand it based on our conversation, that's me actively reconstructing knowledge in my own way.
Precisely. Thirdly, they both recognize that because each learner is unique, with their own prior experiences and ways of making sense of things, the knowledge they construct will also be unique. No two people will ever have perfectly identical understandings. Fourthly, they both dismissed what's called the container metaphor of the mind, the outdated idea that learning is simply about pouring information into an empty vessel.
Good riddance to that image. It always felt wrong.
Indeed. Fifthly, they agreed with Cunningham's idea of abduction. Think of this as the process of coming up with new beliefs or revising your existing ones when your current understanding doesn't quite cut it. They saw this as a fundamental part of how our knowledge grows.
That moment when you suddenly see a problem from a completely new angle and it just clicks, that's abduction at work.
Exactly. And finally, both Hagelin and Andre and Cunningham agreed that education shouldn't just focus on memorizing facts. Instead, it should aim to encourage questioning, critical thinking, and the development of new understandings.
So they're in agreement on some really core principles about how learning happens. Where did Hegland and Andre start to have reservations then?
Right. Their first main criticism focused on how Cunningham actually communicated his ideas about semiotics to an audience of educational psychologists. They felt he didn't do a very effective job of explaining it clearly.
Okay, so he might have had a valid point about semiotics, but he struggled to get that point across to his intended audience.
That was their argument, yeah. They provided several specific examples from Cunningham's article to illustrate this. For one, they pointed out that Cunningham himself acknowledged that even experts in semiotics don't have a single agreed-upon definition of the field. This makes it immediately challenging for someone new to the concept to grasp what it's really all about.
Right. If the people who study it can't agree on what it is, how is someone else supposed to understand it?
Exactly. They also mention his use of the German word Umwelt without providing a clear English translation. Introducing unexplained jargon like that can be a real roadblock for the reader.
It's like trying to follow a recipe written in another language. You might get the general idea, but the important details are lost.
Precisely. Another example they cited was Cunningham's assertion that knowledge is structured like a rhizome. Now, a rhizome is a biological term for an underground stem system with lots of interconnected roots and shoots. While it could be a powerful metaphor for someone familiar with it, it's not exactly a common concept for most educational psychologists. So instead of clarifying how knowledge works, it might just leave people confused.
So this attempt to illustrate his point with this biological concept might have actually obscured it for many readers.
Exactly. And when Cunningham discussed Charles Sanders Peirce's key concepts of sign, object, and interpretant, which Hegland and Andre agreed are fundamental to understanding semiotics, he only gave one example,
Huh.
the word dog in English and French. Just one example to explain such a core idea.
That doesn't seem like enough to really solidify understanding, does it?
That was their point. Hegland and Andre argued that, based on well-established principles within educational psychology, the very field Cunningham was critiquing, he could have been much more effective. They specifically mentioned the importance of using multiple examples and also non-examples, showing what something isn't, to help people really grasp new concepts. This is like a cornerstone of how we teach and learn.
That makes perfect sense. We often understand things better by seeing them in contrast to what they're not.
Absolutely. They even connected this back to prominent cognitive theories of concept acquisition from that time, like prototype theory and the work of Eleanor Rosch and John Anderson, which emphasized the crucial role of examples in forming our mental categories.
So, ironically, Hegland and Andre are suggesting that by applying the basic principles of educational psychology, the field Cunningham was criticizing as outdated, he could have done a much better job of explaining his new ideas about semiotics.
That's a key takeaway here. They even playfully suggested that perhaps this neo-behaviorist, positivistic domain wasn't a complete wasteland if it offered insights into effective communication.
Huh, that's a sharp point. Okay, what was their second major area of disagreement with Cunningham?
Their second major criticism was that Cunningham presented an inaccurate picture of the state of educational, cognitive, and developmental psychology at the time. They strongly argued that the idea of the learner as an active participant who constructs knowledge had become the dominant view in educational psychology for at least the 3 decades leading up to 1992, going all the way back to the 1960s. So they felt Cunningham was somewhat misrepresenting the current state of the field.
So they're saying Cunningham was, to some extent, arguing against a view that the field had largely already moved beyond. Is that it?
That's a fair way to put it, yes. They emphasized the significant shift in focus within the field. It had moved away from solely looking at external environmental factors that influence behavior, and was much more focused on understanding the learner's internal mental processes involved in bringing about conceptual change, how we actually change our understanding of things.
Can you give me a concrete example of how this shift was apparent in the field?
Certainly. They contrasted the definition of learning offered by the behaviorist S.H. White in 1963, a relatively permanent behavior change, which is the result of experience, with a definition from a 1975 introductory educational psychology textbook, which was the process by which one's capability or disposition is changed as a result of experience. You could see a subtle but important shift there, a move towards recognizing internal changes in what a person can do or their general tendencies, not just changes in observable behavior.
Yes, the later definition acknowledges something happening inside the learner's mind, not just what we can see them doing.
Exactly. And by 1989, even influential figures like Lauren Resnick, in her introduction to a collection of essays honoring the cognitive psychologist Robert Glaser, highlighted that contemporary cognitive theory viewed learning as a process of knowledge construction, not of knowledge recording or absorption. She also stressed that learning is knowledge dependent. What you already know significantly impacts what you can learn, and highly tuned to the situation, the context matters. These points directly challenge the idea of a passive learner simply absorbing information.
Those are pretty clear indicators that the field was already embracing the idea of an active learner then.
Precisely. Hegland and Andre also pointed out that even before the cognitive revolution really took hold, there were earlier voices within educational psychology who recognized the active role of the learner. They cited Lee Cronbach's 1964 textbook, which actually quoted Jean Piaget saying, he must achieve concepts for himself. They cannot be handed to him. That's a very direct statement about the learner's active role, and it predates Cunningham's article by almost 30 years.
Wow, that's a significant point. Even back then, this idea was being discussed and acknowledged.
Indeed. Cronbach also noted that meaningfulness depends on the learner's belief system. He is less likely to remember a fact that conflicts with his belief system, again emphasizing how the learner's internal framework shapes what they learn and retain. This belief system isn't just passively received, it's something the learner has actively constructed over time.
Exactly. To further illustrate this, they mentioned a 1936 study cited by Cronbach where children's written versions of the Pledge of Allegiance showed how their existing understandings influenced their comprehension and recall. They weren't just mindlessly repeating words, they were actively trying to make sense of them based on what they already knew.
That's a fantastic example of active knowledge construction in action, even with something as seemingly rote as memorization.
And going back even further, didn't Hageland and Andre also refer to David Ausubel?
Yes, his 1968 textbook, Educational Psychology, A Cognitive View, which famously began with the statement, the most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ausubel argued that new information only becomes meaningful when it can be connected to and integrated into the learner's existing cognitive structure.
That aligns perfectly with this idea of the learner actively building upon their prior knowledge, which, as we discussed, Cunningham also agreed with. So, Hegland and Andre are effectively demonstrating that this core concept wasn't a radical new idea solely being introduced by semiotics. It had been a significant and developing part of educational psychology for a considerable period.
Spot on.
So, how did the broader field of cognitive psychology at the time further solidify this view of the active learner?
Well, Hegland and Andre highlighted Angela DeVessa's 1987 description of the contextualist constructivist position as a concise summary of the cognitive movement's key ideas. This perspective emphasized the dynamic interaction of various factors in any learning situation, including the specific demands of the situation, the individual characteristics of the learner, the nature of the task itself, and, importantly, the learner's personal goals.
That sounds like a much more intricate and dynamic view of learning than simply transmitting information, much more complex.
Precisely. DeVesta argued that the older model of instruction as a one-way transmission of knowledge from teacher to student was outdated. Instead, the cognitive perspective viewed it as a two-way process, where even when the teacher seems to be in control, the student is actively using their existing knowledge, skills, expectations, and goals to construct their own mental understanding.
So the learner is always an active participant in the process, even if their activity isn't always outwardly visible.
Exactly. Hegland and Andre then outlined several specific trends and active research areas within educational psychology at the time that further supported this view of the active learner.
Okay, what were some of these key areas of focus?
Firstly, they pointed to the profound and widespread influence of the work of Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky across various educational domains. Piaget's theories had a major impact on how we understood early childhood education, mathematics education, and even the emerging field of instructional computing. Vygotsky's ideas, particularly around the importance of social interaction and the concept of the zone of proximal development, were also gaining significant traction and being applied in various educational settings.
We often hear their names mentioned when we discuss how children learn and develop, don't we?
Indeed. Secondly, they discussed the schema-theoretic view of reading, which had become a dominant perspective in reading research. This theory proposes that readers actively use their existing knowledge, which is organized into mental frameworks called schemata, to construct meaning from text. The language itself doesn't carry inherent meaning. It acts as a kind of code that learners interpret through the lens of their prior knowledge.
So my understanding of Hegland and Andre's article right now is being actively shaped by how it connects to what I already know about psychology and education.
Precisely. And because everyone's background knowledge is unique to some extent, the meaning each person constructs from the same text will also have its own individual nuances.
That really clarifies why different people can read the same article or hear the same explanation and come away with slightly different interpretations. It makes sense.
Exactly. Thirdly, Hegland and Andre highlighted the increasing emphasis on metacognition, this crucial idea of learners thinking about their own thinking, being aware of their own cognitive processes, and actively taking steps to regulate and improve their learning.
So it's not just about what you know, but also about knowing how you know and how to learn more effectively.
Precisely. And finally, they mentioned the development of intelligent computer coaches in the field of artificial intelligence. These AI programs aim to create models of a student's knowledge and provide personalized guidance within a discovery-based learning environment, often requiring students to actively generate and manipulate multiple representations of their understanding.
That sounds like the computer is actively engaging with the learner's constructed knowledge and trying to guide it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hageland and Andre saw this as yet another compelling example of how the field was moving well beyond the passive learner model, even leveraging technology to support active knowledge construction.
Now, Cunningham put forward some specific ideas about how semiotics could be applied to education. How did Heglin and Andre respond to those specific suggestions?
Well, Hagelin and Andre felt that Cunningham's examples of how semiotics could be used in education lacked the kind of practical detail and demonstrated effectiveness that was already present in other well-established constructivist approaches. They specifically contrasted his suggestions with methods like Anne Brown and Emery Polinsar's reciprocal teaching for improving reading comprehension, and Alan Schoenfeld's detailed work on geometric instruction, both of which provided concrete, empirically supported strategies for educators to use in the classroom.
So, Cunningham's ideas might have been more theoretical, whereas these other approaches offer tangible techniques for teachers to actually implement.
That was their assessment, yeah. They also pointed out a striking similarity between Cunningham's recommendations for history education and earlier curriculum development efforts in the 1960s, such as Jerome Bruner's Man, a course of study, which were heavily influenced by the theories of Piaget and Vygotsky. They noted that Cunningham's ideas echoed the process-oriented curricula of that era, like the Biological Sciences Curriculum Study, BSCS Biology Program, and the Physical Science Study Committee, PSSC Physics Program.
So, again, it seems like the territory Cunningham was exploring wasn't entirely uncharted territory.
Exactly. And they also reminded the reader of a known limitation of those earlier curricula. They sometimes made the assumption that a child's understanding develops in a way that directly mirrors the understanding of an adult scientist. This assumption didn't always hold true in practice and sometimes led to implementation challenges. Kids don't just think like miniature versions of adults.
Precisely. In contrast, Hegland and Andre highlighted examples of contemporary back in 1992, constructivist instruction that had shown empirical value, such as Schoenfeld's research on teacher-learner collaboration in geometry, Alan Collins, John Seeley Brown, and Susan Newman's concept of cognitive apprenticeships in various subject areas, and Brown and Plingsar's reciprocal teaching method.
Right. These approaches emphasized active collaboration, the learner's active role in constructing understanding and learning within meaningful, real-world-like contexts.
It sounds like these were more refined and empirically validated ways of putting constructivist principles into practice.
Absolutely. Now, a significant portion of Hagelin and Andre's critique specifically addressed Cunningham's interpretation of Jean Piaget's theory. Why did they dedicate so much attention to that, do you think?
Well, Piaget's work is so foundational to much of constructivist thinking in education, isn't it? So if Cunningham was misrepresenting Piaget's ideas, that would potentially weaken his argument for needing a completely new framework like semiotics.
Precisely. Hagelin and Andre argued quite strongly that Cunningham misrepresented several key aspects of Piaget's theory, including the fundamental nature of knowledge, the process through which learning occurs, and how cognitive change actually happens. They emphasized that Piaget was a firm critic of the idea that knowledge simply comes from the outside, what he referred to as the empiricist prospect. He didn't believe we just passively absorb information.
So Piaget was definitely not a proponent of a passive learner model. No way.
Absolutely not. Piaget argued that to truly know something, a learner must actively engage with it and transform it, whether through physical actions in early development or through internalized intellectual operations later in life. He viewed knowledge as emerging from the dynamic interaction between the learner and the objects of their learning.
And what about Piaget's concept of a scheme? Cunningham seemed to have a specific interpretation of that.
Right. Hagelin and Andre clarified that for Pedrick, a scheme isn't just some abstract mental representation of reality. Instead, it's what can be repeated and generalized in an action. The earliest schemes are sensoromotor actions, like grasping or sucking, and these form the very foundation for more complex intellectual operations as we develop. So it's about the underlying structure of an action that can be applied in different situations.
Okay, I see.
Precisely. They also addressed Cunningham's claim that Piaget viewed formal operations at higher level of abstract thought as simply abstractions of reality. Hagelin and Andre explained that Piaget saw formal operations as applying operations to operations and transformations to transformations. It's about a more sophisticated level of abstract reasoning, like being able to work with algebraic variables rather than just concrete objects. They also highlighted Piaget's concept of reflective abstraction, which involves drawing structures from one level of understanding and enriching them at a more abstract level, a process they noted has some similarities to Cunningham's idea of reflexivity. So Piaget's theory is more nuanced than Cunningham seemed to suggest.
Definitely sounds like it.
Definitely. Hagelin and Andre emphasize that Piaget would have agreed with Cunningham's point that our knowledge isn't a perfect mirror of reality, and that our experiences are shaped by both the external physical world and our own internal cognitive organization. He argued that similar schemes develop not because our minds are just copying reality, but because individuals interact with similar objects and situations in similar ways.
What about the semiotic function itself? Given its central role in Cunningham's argument, how did Piaget view it?
Interestingly, Hegland and Andre pointed out that Piaget did discuss the semiotic function in a way that they found quite comparable to Cunningham's description. They also noted that while Cunningham suggested Piaget had borrowed ideas from Vygotsky in this area, they found no evidence of that in Piaget's writings on the subject. Instead, they observed that Piaget, much like Cunningham, drew upon the work of thinkers like Charles Sanders Peirce and Ferdinand de Saussure in his understanding of signs and symbols. So, Piaget was engaging with similar foundational ideas as Cunningham, but perhaps integrated them into his own theoretical framework in a different way.
That's a key point.
It is. Hegel and Andre explained that Piaget saw parallels between indexicality, where signs are directly linked to their objects, and the sensory-motor stage of development. He proposed that the semiotic function, which is the ability to use differentiated signs and symbols to represent absent objects or events, doesn't fully emerge until around the second year of life. They use Piaget's well-known example of a child pretending to drink from an empty box as a signifier for a cup as the signified object. That's a clear illustration of a child using one thing to stand for another.
Right, the pretend play stage.
Exactly. And regarding the alleged influence of Vygotsky, Hagelin and Andre stressed that while both Piaget and Vygotsky valued the role of activity in learning, they held fundamentally different views on the relationship between language and thought. For Piaget, language derived its meaning from the underlying cognitive schemes that were built through action, whereas for Vygotsky, language played a more central role in shaping thought, and often took its meaning from the language used by others to describe a child's actions. That's a pretty significant difference in their core perspectives.
It is.
Finally, Hagelin and Andre addressed Cunningham's assertion that the process of cognitive change was a neglected area, particularly his emphasis on abduction and the shift from doubt to new belief. They countered that the process of change, or what Piaget called adaptation, was absolutely central to his theory, involving the three interconnected processes of assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration.
Could you briefly explain what those three processes involve again, just quickly?
Sure. Assimilation is the process of fitting new information or experiences into your existing mental structures or schemes. Accommodation is when you modify your existing structures to make sense of new information that doesn't quite fit. And equilibration is the overarching self-regulatory process that drives cognitive development towards a state of balance between assimilation and accommodation. So Piaget had a comprehensive framework for understanding how our thinking changes and evolves over time.
Right, it wasn't neglected at all then.
Absolutely. Hegland and Andre acknowledged that earlier educational psychology textbooks often presented a simplified view of Piaget, focusing heavily on his stages of development and sometimes misinterpreting key concepts like equilibration. However, they pointed out that more contemporary textbooks, circa 1992, offered a more comprehensive and accurate portrayal of his theory, including these crucial processes of change. They concluded their discussion of Piaget by highlighting his profound and lasting influence on both education and educational psychology, citing influential examples like Strike and Posner's model for conceptual change in science teaching, which is heavily based on Piaget's ideas, and the extensive citation of Piaget's work in mathematics education curriculum and research.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, Hegland and Andre's central argument is basically that while Cunningham raised some important questions about the active role of learners, he didn't fully acknowledge that educational psychology had already embraced this perspective for quite some time. And they also felt that his proposed alternative of semiotics, at least in the way he presented it, didn't offer a uniquely clearer or more advanced framework than the existing constructivist and cognitive approaches that were already being used and researched. Is that about right?
That's a very accurate and concise summary of their main points. They essentially argue that the idea of learners actively constructing their own understanding isn't a new revelation, but rather a well-established and continuously evolving area within educational psychology, supported by a rich body of theoretical work and practical applications that continue to be explored and refined.
So, as you're listening to this, maybe take a moment to reflect on your own learning experiences. How has your understanding of how you learn developed over time? And how might these different perspectives we've discussed, the idea of the active constructor, the critical role of your prior knowledge, the processes of cognitive change influence how you approach acquiring new information or trying to understand viewpoints that differ from your own? Perhaps consider exploring the original works of Piaget, Vygotsky, or delving deeper into schema theory. It might just offer you a fresh perspective on how we all make sense of this complex world.